Why are some Eastern Christian groups called Orthodox and others Catholic?
As early as the 5th century, Eastern Christians identified themselves as Orthodox in distinction to the various heretical factions whose views the Council of Chalcedon had condemned in 451. When the iconoclastic controversy ended in 842, Eastern Christian authorities declared the first feast of Orthodoxy. At that time, the term distinguished the right belief of all supporters of image veneration from all who opposed that essential part of liturgy and devotion. Since the definitive disconnection of several major Eastern churches from papal authority, the term has generally distinguished them from the Uniat, or Eastern Catholic communities that retained or renewed ties to Rome. Eastern Catholic churches include members of the Antiochian, Chaldean, Alexandrine, and Byzantine traditions. Individual bodies are the Ukrainian, Maronite, Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian, Ruthenian, and Melkite, several of which also have their Orthodox counterparts.
What does geography have to do with religion?
A separate subdiscipline of religious studies called the geography of religion investigates how and why religious communities start and spread as they do. Geographers of religion don't just provide us with detailed maps that illustrate spatially where the world's major religious groups are and what percentages of a regional population belong to what tradition. They also study how people attach religious meanings to the physical circumstances in which they live and move. Practically every religious tradition has its sacred geography. Cartographers devise a number of different kinds of maps: physical, political, meteorological. Sacred geography results in what might be called spiritual maps. These spiritual maps exist first of all in the minds of religious believers, and reflect the distinctive perspective of their traditions. But we can also plot on paper how various religious traditions map their world. Places that are especially sacred to a particular community of faith provide believers with a unique kind of orientation to the larger world. In many instances, a special place functions as a spiritual center of the universe, so that everything revolves around it. That is not a measure of the place's actual importance, of course. For many sacred places are relatively insignificant politically and economically, and quite hard to reach physically. Many traditions eventually develop networks of holy places. Their holiness can derive from their association with events in the life of some sacred person, from the belief that some special event occurred there, or simply from the perception that a natural feature such as a tree or mountain or spring possesses unusual spiritual power. What is most important to keep in mind is that physical settings matter a great deal, and that religious traditions claim pieces of this earth as sacred to themselves.
What special rituals do Christians engage in at home?
In Jewish tradition, the home continues to be the center of religious life and education. Many Christians tend to think of church as fulfilling that purpose. As a result, there are few Christian rituals universally associated with the home. Among the few common practices Christians report as important to them are shared reading of Scripture and group prayer. Whether in connection with meals or as a distinct activity. If there is one religious activity that qualifies as a regular ritual in the majority of Christian homes, it is probably the practice of bedtime prayer with the children of the house. This can be a powerful formative influence on young Christians, because they can learn to include others in the orbit of their religious concern. Praying for thus becomes a way of connecting spiritually with the rest of the world.
Are there any other important deist ritual settings apart from public temple and private home?
Perhaps the most common deist sacred space is the spectacular, yet temporary structure unobtrusively called an altar, 10. Usually set up in large open fields or vacant lots. Multi-level facades made of bamboo and covered with colorfully decorated paper simulate grand architectural spaces. These altars are the scene of the major festivals, qiao, that extend over several days. They enshrine such popular deities as the Jade Emperor and Zhang Daoling. Afterwards, the altars are taken down and the decorations burned. Several other ritual venues have been important as well, though not all intended for larger gatherings. Organizations within the various sectarian movements that have come and gone throughout the history of Daoism have typically practiced their own unique and often esoteric rituals, always preceded by elaborate purification. These specialized rituals could take place either in natural settings, such as remote mountain retreats, or in enclosed meditative venues called purity chambers. Their initiates would closet themselves for lengthy periods of disciplined mental focusing.
What is a miracle?
A miracle is broadly defined as an apparent breach in the laws of nature that so defies rational explanation as to suggest the possibility of divine intervention. Miracles or the working of wonders figure prominently in the sacred texts and lore of most major religious traditions. But they do not necessarily serve the same purpose from one tradition to another. In some cases, miracles are believed to provide incontrovertible proof of the truth of a particular revelation by establishing beyond doubt the power of the agent. Miracles are not just a fancy extra tossed in to entertain the masses, but an integral part of some systems of belief. Sometimes miracles occur in the context of a controversy by way of a dramatic settlement in favor of the miracle worker. One characteristic of miracles that does appear to be a feature in many traditions is that those who choose obstinately not to believe do not necessarily change their minds in the presence of a miracle. In fact, they simply do not see what the believers standing next to them see. That seems to suggest that, in some traditions at least, wonders are in the eye of the beholder, so that a witness must be predisposed to see a miracle. Some traditions regard miracles as a gift from a divine source to certain special persons, whether prophets or saints, designed to establish their spiritual credentials. A miracle can revolve around some symbolic action that, even apart from the apparently miraculous result, contains the central message.
Are there any deist holy places?
Mountains are the most prominent of Daoism's sacred sites. But they were sacred to the Chinese long before Daoism. 4 mountains marked the cardinal directions of ancient Chinese symbolic geography, and a 5th was eventually added at the center. Perhaps in connection with the notion of 5 elements: earth, air, water, fire, and metal. Each mountain has its chief deity who discharges his own distinctive duties. A number of individual mountains in addition to the main 5 also possess special properties and are connected with particular deities or deist sects and schools. Mount Heming, Sichuan Province, is famed as the place where Zhang Daoling inaugurated religious Daoism. Deists share Mount Zhongnan, Shenzi Province, with Buddhists as a sacred site. The Celestial Masters School established its center on Mount Longhu, Jiangxi Province. Hundreds of Daoist and Buddhist temples have stood on dozens of such sacred peaks. 2 related features of Daoist sacred geography are the system of 10 great and 36 lesser grotto heavens and 7 Taituo blessed spots, some of which are located on famed mountains. These sites, mostly caves, are so designated because they are foci of sacred energy. They are often associated with religious figures believed to have found meditative solitude there and are likened to heavenly dwellings.
What are the 3 jewels and 5 vows?
Perhaps the closest thing to a summary of Buddhist beliefs is the brief creedal formula of the 3 jewels. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. Buddhists in various places and times have interpreted those jewels rather differently. For many the Buddha was a human teacher and an example, but no more. For many others, the Buddha represented the universal possibility of enlightenment. Still others regard the Buddha, along with countless Buddhists, to be called bodhisattvas, as a divine power and source of grace and salvation. Buddhist tradition retained the important Hindu term dharma but reinterpreted it. For Buddhists, dharma means all that the Buddha taught. They know dharma as enshrined in the sacred texts and communicated by religious teachers. The term Sangha means assembly and refers to the Buddhist order of monks and nuns and, by extension, to the whole community of believers. Along with the affirmation of the three jewels. A secondary but very important affirmation of the precepts or vows. Members of the monastic Sangha take 10 vows, while devout laypersons take the first 5. Many Buddhists begin their day by reciting the 3 refuges, and then adding the 5 precepts. They promise to refrain from killing, theft, unchastity, deception, and intoxication. Reaffirming one's commitment to the precepts functions not unlike a creedal statement of assent to the core beliefs of a religious tradition.
What is sacred space?
Many religious rituals call for a particular physical setting for their proper and effective performance. Nearly every major religious tradition has developed primary ritual sites dedicated in varying degrees to their chief rituals. Mosques, temples, shrines, synagogues, and churches provide the most important communal sacred spaces. But the degree to which the primary ritual sites are dedicated and restricted to specific ritual actions varies. Some ritual spaces are in effect multi-purpose facilities. And some traditions' rituals simply require no special kind of space. But when local communities of most traditions have grown enough to have bank accounts, plans for dedicated facilities are rarely far behind. Individuals and families in some traditions, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, and Shinto, also perform sacred rituals at home. In those instances, believers often establish a small corner of the house as a sacred space or shrine. Some rituals, such as Islamic daily prayer, believers can perform wherever they happen to be. They simply make that place sacred for the duration of the ritual action by intending it to be so. At the other end of the space spectrum are the holy places associated with particular geographical locations such as holy cities and pilgrimage goals. Some traditions establish perimeters around those places, marking them off as sacred and inviolable, sometimes limiting access to believers only.
Have there been important Buddhist mystics?
If transforming encounter with mystery and the cultivation of mental and spiritual states beyond everyday awareness counts as mysticism, then Buddhist tradition can certainly claim its mystics. But there are important differences between Buddhist mysticism and those of traditions such as Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. All three of those traditions talk of at least 2 large categories of extraordinary spiritual experience: in theistic or dualistic mystical experience, the human person meets the divine other but retains his or her individuality. In monistic or cosmic mysticism, the human person becomes one with or realizes the oneness that already exists in an ultimate reality, with no trace of individuality surviving. Buddhist teaching insists that there is no self to begin with, so neither of those two models quite fits. True, some Buddhist schools use the language and symbolism of deity and union. But they understand those symbols as meditative aids rather than representations of metaphysical realities.
What is a kamikaze?
Divine storm blast roughly translates the term kamikaze that so many World War II films brought into relatively common English usage. Japanese began to use the term during the Middle Ages in reference to how the gods fended off the Mongol invaders led by Kublai Khan in 1280, a descendant of Genghis Khan. During World War II, the Japanese Air Force resorted to a desperate tactic when the tide began to turn against Japan. Pilots willing to commit suicide for their nation's honor aimed their explosive-laden dive bombers at enemy warships and went down with them. Ever since then, popular usage has referred to any self-immolating tactic or maneuver born of desperation as a kamikaze mission. However, to identify Shinto narrowly with war or with desperate acts such as those associated with kamikaze pilots is to miss out entirely on an overwhelmingly peaceful and beautiful tradition at whose core is the celebration of life and the sacred riches of creation.
What was religion in ancient Rome?
Like the ancient Greeks, early Romans practiced a form of religion that recognized many gods. As Roman and Greek culture came into closer contact throughout the classical period, Romans began to borrow many Greek religious beliefs, and more ancient Etruscan gods took on the characteristics of Greek gods. Thus, for instance, the Roman Jupiter, the king of gods, became associated with the Greek Zeus. Ceremonies and superstitions played a significant role in the daily lives of Romans. Omens from nature often influenced the actions of leaders, and priests divined the intent of gods by observing the organs of slaughtered animals or the flight of birds. As time passed, Roman religion began to lose favor among the people. As Roman society became more decadent, there arose the need for a religion that offered greater moral and spiritual assurances. A new religion, Christianity, gained in popularity and eventually became the primary faith of Rome. In addition to Greek culture influencing religion in Rome, other facets of Roman culture were also affected by the Greeks. The Romans held significant esteem for Greek life and adopted certain elements from it. Ranging from sculpture to libraries, architecture to philosophy, while preserving some of their own valuable strengths. The result of this merging of ideas is known as Greco-Roman culture.
What other early scriptures are especially important for Hindus?
Over a span of perhaps 2,000 years, c. 3000 to 1000 BCE, according to some Indian scholars. Hindu ritual specialists produced a substantial body of sacred literature by way of commentary and reflection on the Vedas. The earliest of these works were manuals for priests, or brahmanas, each attached to one of the four Vedas. These brahmanas elaborated on the mythic stories to which the Vedic hymns often had made only passing allusions. Expanding on the tradition much as the early Jewish rabbis had developed the oral Torah. The brahmanas served the practical purpose of recording for posterity precise directions for correct ritual performance. Still another layer of scriptural development gave rise to a series of works called Aranyakas, forest treatises, composed by and for hermits. These texts offered further commentary on the Vedas meant to foster the contemplative life. Aranyakas were connected with the Brahmanas much as the Brahmanas were linked to the various Vedas. With their emphasis on inward reflection, the Aranyakas signal an important turn away from the ancient Vedic and Brahmanical reliance on external ritual. Another type of sacred text called the Upanishads evolved from about 1500 to 500 BCE. The name Upanishad means, loosely, sitting at the feet of a mentor. These remarkable documents, many in the form of a dialogue between teacher and student, reflect deeply on the nature of the divine and of the self. Life's true meaning rests not primarily in dealing with forces beyond human control, but in understanding both the ultimate causes of all things and the relationship of the self to those causes. The Upanishads represent major developments known collectively as Vedanta, the end or culmination of the Vedas.
What's the difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews?
Prior to 1492 there were large Jewish communities on the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain, and Portugal. During the final phases of the Catholic reconquest of Spain, Jews were given the option of converting or going into exile. Many of those who chose to leave migrated all over the Mediterranean basin, including North Africa and the Middle East, to found new communities. These descendants of Iberian Jewry are called Sephardic Jews. They comprise a small minority, perhaps 20% or less, of the global Jewish population. Sephardic Jews retain a number of distinctive ritual and legal interpretations, and in some places manage to preserve the Ladino language of their ancestral Iberia and maintain separate educational institutions. By far the majority of Jews are Ashkenazim. Their name derives from the medieval Hebrew designation of Central Europe as Ashkenaz. Descendants of the early Jewish settlers in Central and Eastern Europe preserve Ashkenazic traditions all over the world. Most Jewish immigrants to the United States have been Ashkenazim, although the majority of the earliest, in colonial times, were Sephardim. In general, Jews in the Americas have not maintained a serious distinction between Sephardic and Ashkenazic customs and practices. And few synagogues nowadays restrict membership one way or the other.
What kind of calendar do Shinto practitioners observe?
Shinto reckoning of ritual time has been much influenced by Chinese traditions. As early as 675 CE, religious Daoism had made a significant impact on the Japanese imperial court, which formally adopted many Daoist practices. Most importantly, the court set up a special bureau of divination, called the Onmyrio, Office of Yin-Yang, based on Daoist principles. One of the Onmyrio's chief functions was to establish a liturgical calendar that patterned earthly life on the rhythms of the cosmos. This lunar calendar retains all the main features of its Chinese model, including the cycles of 60 years based on the combinations of 12 branches and 10 stems. See the sections on Daoism and Confucianism. The Japanese call their Chinese version of the lunar calendar Kyurki, as distinct from the modern solar calendar adopted in 1872, the Shinriki, an early formal cycle of annual observance, called the Nanchugyuji, literally year-round discipline rituals, developed as early as the 10th century CE. Imperial authorities promulgated it in a vast historical record called the Enji Shiki, Institutes of the Enji era. 901–23 CE, an essential source of information about Shinto ritual in general. Japan's lunar calendar needs to tuck in an extra month every 3 years or so. Prior to the 19th century, many Shinto shrines maintained their own calendars of events, including uniquely regional and local festivities. Today some major events still take place according to various ways of adapting the lunar calendar to fit the solar. For example, some festivals now occur on the same numbered day within the same numbered month, but transferred to the solar reckoning. In other words, a festival that fell on the 7th day of the 7th lunar month now falls on July 7th. Some festivals are now dated by keeping the day date but adding a solar month, so that a celebration once held on the 7th day of the 7th month now occurs on August 7th. Finally, and more rarely, a few special days retain their lunar dating completely, so that they rotate backwards against the solar year. From the solar point of view, therefore, these are movable feasts. Since the late 19th century, the timing of the major festivals has been coordinated so that all the larger shrines observe them at the same time. But there are still many distinctive local and regional festivities attached to individual shrines, such as the rituals dedicated to the patron deities of particular places. In addition to the liturgical calendar, an important related feature is the Japanese custom of dividing history according to imperial reigns or epochs. Emperor Hirohito died in 1989, ending the Showa era, and his son Akihito's accession inaugurated the Heisei epoch.
Do Buddhists have a system of religious law?
A great deal of the Hindu tradition of religious law that affected the young Siddhartha's life concerned ritual stipulations and social restrictions. By fundamentally rejecting Vedic ritual practice as ineffectual and the caste system as discriminatory, the Buddha virtually wiped out at a stroke any need for much of the kind of legislation that is so central to religious systems such as Hinduism, Judaism, and Islam. Buddhist tradition does, however, have its own distinctive regulatory concerns. They have to do mostly with individual conduct. The eight-spoked wheel of the law symbolizes Buddhist ethical teaching in general.
What was the Holocaust?
The term Holocaust derives from a pair of Greek words that mean whole burnt offering. The term originally referred to a kind of sacrifice performed in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. In more common contemporary usage, however, Holocaust refers to the suffering and death of as many as 6 million Jews during World War II as a result of Adolf Hitler's final solution. Jews all over Europe were systematically targeted by Nazi propaganda and police action. The Shoah, as it is called in Hebrew, began in 1933 and escalated dramatically after Kristallnacht. The Night of Shattered Glass, November 9 to 10, 1938. According to the Nazi view, only a return to Aryan racial purity could save the human race. With their Semitic blood, Jews were a source of racial pollution and needed to be exterminated. Throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s, Hitler and his collaborators, led by the Gestapo, Geheimstaatspolizei, or State Secret Police, and the feared Blackshirt SS, Schutzstaffel, rounded up hundreds of thousands of Jews and herded them into boxcars for transport to concentration camps scattered through Central and Eastern Europe. Many prisoners too small or too weak to work were immediately taken to the gas chambers, often disguised as showers, where they were killed with Zyklon B gas. The Holocaust represents one of history's most extraordinary and horrifying examples of both genocide and scapegoating.
Is there a system of deist religious law?
Apart from the charters or disciplinary codes of deist organizations such as monastic orders, there is no such thing as formal deist religious law. The very idea goes against the grain of the concept of natural balance and harmony that is so central to deist thought. That is not to say that there aren't countless standard practices and expectations as to behavior. The difference between Daoism and, say, Islam or Christianity, in this respect is that the Muslim and Christian traditions have systematically codified those expectations while the deist has not. Every cultural and religious system has its standards and sanctions. But in the cases of both Islam and Christianity, independent legal systems became necessary largely because the religious traditions expanded into new cultural settings very different from those in which the traditions arose. In the case of Daoism, religion and culture have been much more closely and consistently identified, making a separate system of religious law largely unnecessary.
What role does authority play in religion?
At its best, religious authority provides needed guidance for individuals and functions as a moral compass for the community. It also serves as a community's backbone and a powerfully cohesive force. At its worst, religious authority, like any other kind, can be abusive and manipulative, playing on members' guilt and lack of confidence in their own sense of justice. Major religious traditions have developed a wide variety of authority structures. Some have highly centralized administrative systems, as in Roman Catholicism, the Church of the Latter-day Saints, Mormons, and the main branch of Shia Islam. The chain of command begins with God and descends through various levels of scholars, specialists, and bureaucrats. Those at the upper levels make decisions on large questions, and those down the line communicate the decisions to the people and implement them. Structures of this sort can tend toward either a monarchy or an oligarchy, depending on the relative dominance of the person and office at the top. The hallmark of centralized structures is that they strive to elicit conformity from all members. At the other extreme are traditions in which authority is entirely local, centered in the village, as in tribal traditions or village Hinduism, or in the individual community place of worship or gathering, such as the churches of the Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers. Many traditions fall somewhere between these two extremes. They have no direct line of authority from top to bottom, but local communities can be affiliated by conventions or conferences, for example. Many Japanese Shinto shrines belong to national associations. Baptist churches often belong to national conventions that meet regularly to decide organization-wide policy. American Muslim community leaders have formed the National Councils of Imams. In most of these cases and dozens of others like them, the majority of decisions are made locally.
Do Shinto practitioners use special symbolism in personal or private rituals?
Many Japanese households have a special corner dedicated to the kami, a miniature shrine building. Kami dana, at which worshippers pray daily, is placed on a shelf or table. For special occasions they will go to the actual shrine. but everyday reverence to the kami happens at home. People can purchase these charming miniature shrines, some done up in exquisitely fine architectural detail, at religious goods stores in any Japanese city or at some of the larger shrines. Worshippers who get them from shrine shops often prefer to purchase them at shrines to which their families have ancestral connections. Priests often visit parishioners to dedicate their new home shrines, and sometimes make annual house visits for brief renewal ceremonies. People with more ample homes and yards might afford larger outdoor miniature shrines called yashikigami, kami of the home. Miniature shrines range from simple and affordable to finely wrought and costly. Business establishments, restaurants, police stations, and bridges on ocean-going ships, for example, might also have a kamidana to which the staff make daily offerings. Many miniature shrines have their own tiny torii gates and shimenawa. In addition, worshippers often bring small votive offerings when they visit local shrines. A popular offering is the miniature torii gate on which devotees write names and prayers of petition before hanging it on a rack along with hundreds of others like it at the shrine.
What about more specific directives?
One of the earliest scriptures in the Pali Canon is the Vinyapitaka, the basket of discipline. Buddhist law generally emphasizes the thou shalt nots over the thou shalts. On the negative side, the Vinaya lists several hundred actions considered offensive and unacceptable behavior for monks and nuns. Of those, some 250 apply to monks and 348 to nuns. Topping the list for all monks and nuns is a group of 10 precepts that forbid lying, intoxicating substances, adultery, theft, killing, eating after noon, elegant beds, cosmetics, frivolous entertainment, and possession of luxuries. The first 5 also apply to lay persons, who might also choose to observe the next 3 on the 4 special monthly duty days or Sabbaths. Monks and nuns are automatically expelled from the monastic community for killing a human being or an animal. Grand larceny, or sexual misconduct. Other important categories in monastic law include offenses that require a community consultation, those that call for restitution of some kind, return of goods improperly received, and issues of due process in resolving problems. Apart from these specific regulations, Buddhist teaching offers a number of more general guidelines for lay people. It recommends, for example, seeking adequate income, acquiring a professional skill, frugality, freedom from debt, and giving generously to good causes.
What is a religious calendar?
Since anchoring sacredness in time is so fundamental, most religious traditions have developed ways of keeping precise track of their distinctive ways of hallowing the days and years. Religious, sometimes called liturgical, calendars establish a definitive pattern of moments meant to recall specific events in the life of a divine or foundational figure. Each year thus becomes a replay of the sacred person's life in miniature. An annual calendar can also symbolically recapitulate the whole expanse of a tradition's sacred history by laying out essential events in sequence on a timeline. With every year, then, the community celebrates a renewal in faith. Confident that each new cycle brings with it sufficient spiritual aid to carry on. The religious calendar functions as a kind of map of time that highlights certain seasons. Even the times between the high festivities thus take on special meanings as periods of waiting or expectation. In traditions that view time as linear, the religious calendar seems to have a forward motion, rising to a peak and moving toward a symbolic end of history. For traditions with a more cyclic understanding of history, the calendar year is just another in an endless series of cycles, with its own high and low points marked by feasts or religious holidays.
What does the term historical critical method mean?
When Christians study their scriptures, they can take any of a number of approaches, as already suggested. A common pastoral approach nowadays reads the scriptures almost entirely as if they are addressed to 20th century Christians and are thus in a way timeless and not subject to historical conditions. Another approach tries to get behind the words as much as possible to understand their meaning in their original context. This second approach by no means disregards the personal, pastoral, and deeply spiritual implications of the sacred text. But it begins with the assumption that one cannot know those deeper meanings without first understanding how and why the inspired authors wrote as they did. Historical critical scholarship looks, for example, at the differences in how even texts as generally concordant as the Synoptic Gospels show divergences in vocabulary, major themes, order of events in the life of Jesus, and points of view tailored to different audiences. It notes how the inspired authors, as much editors as original writers, interwove Jesus' words and actions, telescoping time and space. As skilled literary communicators, the inspired writers also made use of stylized scenes that followed predictable patterns in their description of the main actors, actions, and crowd responses. Combining analyses of the literary, linguistic, and historical elements, the historical critical method seeks insight into how these documents, 2 millennia and many layers of culture removed from us, appear to speak in so many distinct voices about the same great spiritual reality. Underlying it all, the method suggests, are the unique theological insights granted to each of the sacred authors. Each offers a characteristic reflection on the deeper meaning of the good news and of Jesus the Christ. For Mark, Jesus was most of all the suffering servant; for Matthew, the Messiah; for Luke, the Savior whose ongoing presence is the Holy Spirit; and for John, the Divine Son. These are not exclusive, but complementary insights. Unlike the predominantly spiritualized or pastoral method of interpretation, whose immediate concern is to deal with apparent inconsistencies among the sacred authors by harmonizing them into a seamless reconstruction, the historical critical method seeks a unity of scriptural revelation through the uniqueness and diversity of the evidence.
Who was Lao Zi?
Lao Zi was likely an altogether legendary figure whose name simply means old teacher or master. Tradition says he was born around 604 BCE, making him a much older contemporary of Confucius. Kongfu Zi, 551 to 479 BCE, who was in turn an almost exact contemporary of the Buddha. The legend says Lao Zi was a clerk in the archives of the Zhou dynasty who practiced the way and its power and emphasized self-effacement and anonymity. When he became convinced that social disintegration and political corruption in the Zhou dynasty were irreversible, he decided to withdraw from society. Riding his water buffalo, the old man came to the frontier. There a customs officer besought him to write down his lofty teachings before departing. Lao Zi wrote the Dao De Jing, the classic of the way and its power, and disappeared, leaving a legacy of mystery. Much later stories, perhaps from a time when Daoists and Confucians were in competition for followers, tell of a meeting between Lao Zi and a youthful Confucius. No use wasting so much time studying your history, Lao Zi counseled the newcomer. Observe nature and you will see that love for the Dao is all that one needs. Popular tradition tends to identify Lao Zi as the one who first taught that ordinary folk could seek and attain immortality. Some scholars suggest that Lao Zi's legendary stature may have been enhanced as a result of his mistaken identification with the legendary Huang Di, known as the Yellow Emperor who ruled in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. Lao Zi was officially declared a god around 666 CE.
What are trigrams and hexagrams?
Trigrams are sets of 3 vertically stacked horizontal lines made up of every possible combination of broken and solid line. Solid lines stand for the solar male yang, hot, bright, active, and dry. Broken lines stand for the earthy and lunar female yin, which is dark, moist, mysterious, and associated with valleys. Combinations of yin and yang in varying proportions give rise to the 8 essential elements in creation. Traditional presentations usually arrange the 8 trigrams as an octagon, at whose center stands the Tai Chi symbol for perfect yin-yang harmony. Each trigram is arrayed so as to face its opposite in the set. So for example, if you held a compass before you with north pointing up, heaven's 3 solid lines would stand across from Earth's 3 broken lines at what would be north and south. At due east stands water, with a solid line between a pair of broken lines, across from fire, with its broken line sandwiched between solids in the west. At northwest, lake's broken solid, reading from top to bottom, stands across from mountains solid broken. And in the northeast, wind's solid broken balances off thunder's broken solid. Take the 8 trigrams and arrange them in all possible permutations by stacking one trigram atop another, and you get 64 hexagrams. Pile heaven upon heaven and the result is called the creative principle. Add earth to earth and you get the passive principle. Earth over heaven yields peace, while heaven over earth means stagnation. The single most important source for interpreting these arcane indicators is the I Ching, the classic of change. Tossing and rearranging a set of 50 sticks and then reading them as hexagrams with the help of that text remains a widely popular form of divination.
How do deists worship at home and throughout the day when they are not in temples?
Worshippers perform at home many of the same rituals they perform in the temple. Home shrines or family altars are miniature versions of the temple's sacred objects. Smaller images of the various deities enjoy places of honor. Before the image, family members place a few apples or oranges, for example. And small incense pots hold small burning sticks just as the kettle in the temple courtyard does. Many devout Chinese begin their day by offering incense to the terrestrial deity of the home, who is sometimes depicted as 5 separate figures recalling the 5 elements. This earth deity is at the bottom of an administrative flow chart, reporting to the district deity, who in turn reports to the city god, and he to the country god. Offerings to family ancestors and consultation with an almanac as to the spiritual qualities of the particular day are other regular rituals. Many private individuals still practice Tai Chi Chuan, a set of rhythmic movements designed to balance yin and yang and maximize energy.
What does one do to convert to Hinduism?
Throughout its long history, Hinduism's ranks have swelled with the addition of entire tribes and other social groups that came under the influence of Hindu kingdoms. Formal conversion to Hinduism nowadays is relatively rare in India, at least among Indian nationals. Membership in the tradition's many sub-communities is far more a matter of heredity than of deliberate choice. Some non-Indians have migrated to India out of a desire to enter Hinduism formally. They typically present themselves at the temple or ashram of their choice and ask to join. and over the past several decades small numbers of Europeans and Americans have joined. Various missionary-minded branches of the Hindu tradition, such as the Vedanta Society, with its associated monastic order, or the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Some communities provide prospective new members basic instruction in the teachings of the group's founders and in the sacred texts. But membership does not depend on formal assent to a particular creed or system of doctrine. The one important and nearly universal ritual symbolizing conversion is the naming ceremony, or namakarana. Taking a new name, often containing a reference to the deity one chooses to worship, symbolizes the devotee's seriousness and commitment.
What is a minion?
When Jews gather for worship, they need a minimum number in attendance, or quorum. Orthodox tradition excludes women from being counted toward the minimum of 10 members over 13 years of age. But both Reformed and conservative traditions have in recent times voted to count women in the minyan. The accommodation presupposes that women in the local community have passed their bat mitzvah, a rite of passage not open to Orthodox women. The notion of a religious quorum seems to rest on a fairly clear distinction between private and public worship. Since public or communal worship is of a different order than private worship, tradition draws a clear line between them. So when there are not enough people to form a minyan, everyone returns home or prays privately in the synagogue.
Is the contemporary sect Falun Gong Daoist?
Falun Gong, Dharma Will cultivation, also called Falun Dafa, Dharma Will of the Buddha Way, was founded in 1992 by Li Hongzhi and received official approval by China's Research Society of Qigong Science. Its principal symbol is a circle with a clockwise rotating swastika at its center. Around the central swastika are 4 Taiji symbols. At the cardinal directions, alternating with 4 more swastikas. The swastika is an ancient symbol of apparently South or Central Asian origin that has long been associated with both Hinduism and Buddhism. The iconographic significance of the various rotating symbols is related to the concept of chakras, or energy centers, within the body. Within each person, therefore, resides a miniature of the whole spinning cosmos. This correspondence between the microcosm of the individual and the macrocosm of the universe is an important link to Daoist thought. Falun Gong advertises itself as an alternative to traditional religious traditions such as Daoism and Buddhism, and to practices such as Qigong and Taiji Chuan. Its spiritual leader, Li Hongzhi, says his purpose is to bring ancient wisdom again within reach of ordinary people who find the traditional systems no longer helpful. Drawing on Daoist imagery, Falun Gong's meditative method, combined with ritual movement, aims at helping practitioners to balance, maximize, and release their energies. Chinese authorities almost certainly had complex motives in attempting to suppress the sect in 1999. One concern may be the ancient connection religious Daoism had with messianic and revolutionary movements.
How and where do members of local Buddhist communities come together?
Temples are the focal point of Buddhist activity in most places. Many temples are freestanding institutions, while others are part of larger monastic complexes. At the heart of the temple is the primary ritual space. Some can accommodate sizable groups, but since ordinary Buddhist ritual tends to be an individual matter, central worship spaces are generally not strikingly capacious. Larger temples nowadays often have other facilities dedicated to communal functions on special occasions. People might visit their local temples individually or in smaller groups at any time on any day.
Are there other distinctive Shinto rites of passage or initiation?
Several types of ceremony and celebration are associated with various stages in life. Tradition recommends that parents, formerly the grandmother, since mothers remained impure for a time after childbirth, bring 32-day-old boys or 33-day-old girls to the shrine for a special blessing. This first shrine visit, Hatsumiya Mairi, functioned as the infant's initiation into the Shinto shrine community. Older children also have their days. Each November 15th, a festival called Shishigo-sen 753, marks a rite of passage for both boys and girls. 3- and 7-year-old girls and 5-year-old boys don their fanciest dress-up outfits for a shrine visit to pray for a safe and happy future. Putting on special clothes is a major ingredient in rites of initiation. Young people reach the age of adulthood at 20. On Coming of Age Day, see Jinohai, January 15 each year. Young adults, especially women, visit shrines in formal attire for a blessing. Other coming-of-age observances identify manhood with age 17 and womanhood with 19. Acknowledging the difficulty of life's changes with the bestowal of protective talismans. Many older Japanese still observe rites of passage that acknowledge the challenges of aging. They may visit shrines when they reach the ages of 61, 70, 77, 88, and 99. To ask for protection and blessings.
Are there anything like denominations or sects within greater Hinduism?
Mark Twain once observed that compared to India, other lands and cultures were paupers in religion. He was referring to the large number of major religious traditions that have been born in India or had a significant impact in Indian history. Hindu tradition alone accounts for an astounding diversity. Most Hindus belong to one of two major denominations. Called Sampradaya in Sanskrit, handing down, tradition. Devotees of Vishnu and his various manifestations or avatars are called Vaishnavites, or Vaishnavas. Shaivites, or Shaivas, are those for whom Shiva and the various names and forms of divinity associated with him offer the path to salvation. Two other smaller groups within the greater Hinduism are also important. Hindus who focus on the feminine manifestations of Shiva's divine power, Shakti, are called Shaktas. Shaktism is also sometimes called Tantrism because of its connection with a category of esoteric scriptures called Tantras. So-called right-handed Shaktas espouse practices very much like the other Bhakti traditions, emphasizing worship of the goddess. Sects described as left-handed tend to be more secretive and esoteric. Finally, the term Smarta as it is commonly used now refers to Hindus for whom the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, represents the greatest hope of spiritual realization. Some Smartas adhere to the Advaita or monistic philosophical teaching of Shankara. Others are devotionally and ritually eclectic, focusing on one of 5 names and forms of God: Vishnu, Shiva, Durga, Ganesha, and Surya, as their chosen deity. These 4 designations are still very broad groupings, each of which is made up of a number of sub-denominations or sects.
What kinds of rituals do Jews engage in privately or alone?
Home remains the principal place for Jewish prayer and religious observance. Traditional prayer includes the thrice daily Amida, standing, prayer in morning, afternoon, and evening. The morning and evening prayers begin with benedictions that praise God's love of Israel as manifested in the creation of light and in the ordering of day and night. The Shema follows, acknowledging the one God's redemption of the people. At the center of all 3 prayers is the Shemana Esrei, or 18 blessings. Prayer ends with the Elenu, upon us praise is incumbent. Afternoon prayer usually adds Psalm 145. According to the Talmud, all Jews should pray 100 benedictions. Barakot, every day, in recognition of all things enjoyable, to give thanks. And prior to all other religious duties, in addition to the blessings that are part of daily prayers.
What is the tree of Jesse?
According to ancient tradition, Jesus was a direct descendant of King David, who was the son of a successful farmer named Jesse. Beginning in the Middle Ages, the tree of Jesse became a very widespread visual symbol displayed especially in the stained glass windows of Europe's great Gothic cathedrals and in illustrated manuscripts of the Bible. Depictions of the tree typically show an aged Jesse sitting or lying down, with a large tree growing from his upper body or from the middle of his back. On the lower branches and trunk are shown the faces of David and Solomon and their royal descendants, along with other important figures in the genealogy of Jesus. An image of Mary holding the child Jesus typically appears at the apex of the tree. The symbolism emphasizes both Jesus' royal legitimacy and Mary's restitution for the evil originally caused by Eve eating from the tree of knowledge.
What are the Islamic rituals of marriage? Do Muslims favor arranged marriages?
In the United States, Muslim nuptials, called nikah in Arabic, can occur in the prayer hall of the local mosque in a separate ceremony not connected with the regular ritual prayer. In other places, weddings typically occur in homes or in the presence of a Muslim judge, called a qadi. The imam of the mosque, or the judge, presides over the ceremony and may offer religious reflections on the sacredness of the marriage contract. In some countries, elaborate processions and housewarming ceremonies are part of the festivities. As in many other traditions, two witnesses attest to the agreement. Written documentation includes both mosque records and the usual license required by civil law. A reception called a walima, pronounced walima, follows weddings nearly everywhere. In some countries, the bridal dowry remains an essential item in the social contract between families. Many Muslim families continue to prefer marriages in which the parents do the initial negotiating. They present their favored prospect to their son or daughter. But in most situations, the young people have the option of declining. Many Muslims regard open dating as undesirable and believe the arranged relationship is healthier and more acceptable morally. Some parents will even take out ads, especially on behalf of a daughter, in the personal sections of Muslim publications, seeking interested parties who are well educated and religiously committed.